Subnautica. Despite it being terrifying at times, it still remains a very unique survival experience. Not many games truly capture the idea of submerging yourself in water for extended periods of time or throughout a majority of the game. Most of the time in many survival games you may just be swimming around in puddles for a little bit, but you're mainly on land. What I plan to do is briefly touch on and give a very short synopsis of each major event in the game, and then come back to it and explain it in better depth later on throughout the video. To start off with a release date, Subnautica was released in 2014, part of an early access program, and achieved full release in 2018. They did a lot of changes, most of which we will be discussing in this video, but mainly I wanted to talk about story because after all, this is probably going to be named a lore video of some type. I'm talking too much, let's just get right into the video. Let's just kind of speedrun the beginning because it does feel kind of slow burn. You're playing as a protagonist named Riley Robinson. You're working on a ship called the Aurora, but then it explodes, so. There are many other people on the Aurora working as well, and they escaped in their own life pods. Your character Riley worked as a non-essential systems maintenance chief. Unfortunately, the life pod starts going kaput and breaking off, and you get knocked out by a panel. You are knocked out for only a few hours, but this costed the rest of the crew their lives. We'll touch on why shortly. There are several life pods that we have to go to in this game, and they all have their own PDAs and logs kind of showcasing what happened. But for now, let's just touch on Riley as a character. Oddly enough, there's not a whole lot of backstory to him. We know he worked on the Aurora for the company known as Alterra, which we'll touch on. He does not talk, he is mute, but he does make some noises sometimes. This ranges from slight grunts to pained injury noises. Well, that's Riley Robinson out of the way, so let's talk about the passengers.
This is Officer Keenan, Life Pod 19. The captain is gone.
So, you have a radio in your life pod and you can build one with the habitat builder. And this radio is going to help you receive distress signals. These distress signals are from other crash survivors. Your life pod was number 5, so you won't be seeing number 5 on this list. We'll start with Keen. Keen was a second officer on the Aurora. As the life pods were dropping, Captain Hollister, the captain of the Aurora, had ordered Keen to send a message to all the other survivors and regroup at the floating island. The floating island is rather large, and it's supported by ancient floaters. It was said to be a rendezvous point for all of them. Unfortunately, all we know is that him and another person, CTO U, the person known as CTO U, wanted to search for more survivors, and Keen didn't want her to. But in turn, Keen ended up going with her. He would later send a PDA 2 hours later and say that him and Yu were lost at sea. He also claimed they were intercepted by a Leviathan-class predator before they could reach the ship. This highly alludes to the fact that Yu was probably murdered by a Reaper Leviathan. Let's touch on CTO Yu. She was Life Pod 2, and Commander Keen was Life Pod 19. She had sunk 500 meters below the surface before abandoning the life pod. She had a subordinate named Berkeley, whom she had escaped with. But unfortunately, on the way to the floating island, Berkeley was nowhere to be found. This highly implies that either you had left him or he had died along the journey. The relationship between them seemed pretty close. There were logs of them going back and forth, but in a playful, hateful friendship sort of way. Although she's higher up in the chain of command, she treated him well. Life Pod 3 is referring to themselves as Life Pod 3. They claim that they were repairing their damaged Sea Glide. Of course, to no surprise, you go to check them out, and their life pod, which is rather close, there's a big hole in it. Life Pod 13, however, it was claimed to be a high-priority automated message. It was by a Mongolian man named Joji Kasar. He was meant to assist with the search for Degasi survivors, which were a group of Mongolians cast away pretty much on this planet, which we'll touch on. In the emissary's voice log for Khazar, there are a lot of announcements going on. As soon as he enters the planetary atmosphere, the external temperature reaches critical levels. The hull starts damaging, impact is imminent, with life support systems failing. He mumbles to himself about how he would like to be returned. He is accepting his fate and his death at this time, and he is asking for reincarnation. His log suggests he is highly nationalistic and religious, which is a common stereotype to Mongolians. He was having a debate of sorts with another Aurora crew member. The crew member claimed Khazar's argument was religious nonsense. Life Pod 7, however, was from an unnamed crew member. They claim that the pod is structurally sound, but the fabricators bust, in quotation marks. But they request assistance. However, as we know, we really don't meet any survivors at all in this game, so they're just goners. The next life pod is Life Pod 17, another person presumed dead, this time with the name Ozzy, and his occupation is cafe owner. It is widely believed that a crab snake was what destroyed the hull and killed the passengers inside the life pod. He claims that there was a grim-looking snake thing trying to eat through the hull. Me personally, I immediately thought Reaper Leviathan when I heard it, just because I heard the word grim and I thought of Grim Reaper, but that's just me. He later sends another crew log, saying that the Aurora was carrying everything needed to build the phase gate, which was propulsion cannons, bioreactors, and mobile vehicle bays. He was listing off all the good areas of the Aurora, including his own cafe, and he ends it with, "I don't know why no one's coming for me." Really a depressing last sentence. LifePod 12, however, had sunk in some place called the Bulb Zone. They said it was too deep to dive without some proper gear. This LifePod was home to a man called Danby, who was a medical officer on the Aurora. His status is definitely deceased due to the car infection or just blood loss, or maybe both. After the crash, he starts freaking out in his log, saying that he was never really technically a medical officer, he cheated on the exams. He would later claim that he was infected with Kara and he doesn't know what it is. He has glowing green pustules on his hands, which is what our character gets later on. He had most likely died pretty fast because it was an emergency broadcast that was an automated message instead of a message that was recorded himself, similar to the other life pods and what they did. We have Life Pod 4, which unfortunately landed in the crash zone. Not much is entirely known, it's pretty much just another survivor saying help me. They did recommend a radiation suit due to the effects of the Aurora, but that's pretty much their story. Then we have Life Pod 6. Similar story with them, they were a random survivor asking for help, and there was a big hole in it by the time he got there. So, now that those sort of bite-sized pieces of stories for each of the life pods are out of the way, let's just touch on something a little bit larger. Let's touch on the Degasi survivors. Now, Alterra, the company that you work for, is rather large in comparison to the Torgal company. Now, why am I bringing up this corporation? Well, that is the corporation that had owned the ship known as the Degasi. The Degasi was a ship that crashed about a decade prior to the Aurora crashing on the same planet. It was a Mongolian vessel that was shot down by the Quarantine Enforcement Platform, which for now we'll just say is a giant alien turret that's trying to keep you from leaving. Those were Paul, Bart, and Margaret Maida? Pretty bad with last names, so I'll just call her Margaret. Now, Paul was the CEO of the corporation, and Bart was the heir to the throne, so to speak. Margaret was a mercenary for hire, on board the Degasi in case of pirate attacks. We can piece together the story through their sea bases, land bases, and their PDAs. But here's the story of how everything unfolded. After they had crash landed, they actually wound up on the floating island. This is where they made their first base. There are a small handful of base structures scattered throughout the island. You can easily tell by context clues that they were trying to find a stable source of food. They were growing marble melons and Chinese potatoes. Unfortunately, all that had to come to a stop. Margaret insisted they have to explore the ocean because eventually they were going to have to. Due to a storm, however, part of the base was wiped out, and Margaret found a new cave system area. This is known as the Jelly Shroom Caves in Subnautica, home to the crab snakes. They built their second base in here, however that base in the Jelly Shroom Caves begins to leak, so they try to find an even deeper place to base, and this is where they make their final sea base, known in the game as the Grand Reef Biome. So Bart the Heir had figured out about this Kara bacterium that infected every living thing on the planet, and they also knew that they were all infected with it too. The Kara bacterium has no known cure since it's not in their database. In order to try to find a cure for it, Margaret was going on a fetch quest to find life forms for him to study on it. While these tests were going on and people were arguing within the base, a Reaper Leviathan had attacked their final base, and Paul, Margaret, and Bart were all forced out of it. The group becomes separated. Margaret fights off the Reaper Leviathan. Paul finds a light deep into the biome of the Grand Reef, but is presumably killed by a crab squid, as you can see from the game's trailer. Bart is the only known survivor at this time to have gotten out of the Grand Reef. He builds a new base and he begins to study the bacterium even more, but things just get a little hectic with it, and he starts having worse visions, and the infection just spreads rapidly all over his body. It gets worse to where he can't take it anymore, and he makes one last log on the floating island where it all started. His last log is filled with regret. He said he should have listened to his father about venturing deeper into the biome. Now you think that this whole storyline would probably be over. But 10 years later, when Alterra sends the Aurora to build a phase gate, they had some other plans in mind. You see, there was one log I didn't mention yet, and I was saving it for this moment. It was Officer Keen talking to a couple crew members about the Degasi team. The context clues in the PDA clearly state that they're doing a search and rescue mission on the Degasi survivors. Keen gives a reason for this. You see, the Torgal Corporation was with the Mongolian independent states, and Alterra and the Mongolian independent states made an agreement. That agreement was to try to find and possibly rescue the Degasi survivors. What ended up happening was that they had found a scan. Keen said to turn off the recorder as one of the crew members said it, and what ended up happening was the giant alien turret of sorts had shot down the Aurora. The Aurora got too close and within the range of the quarantine enforcement platform while they were trying to scan for the survivors. Now that we touch on all the survivors in the main game, I actually wanted to go back to pre-Subnautica area. This is going to heavily explain the backstory and lore to what you're seeing on this planet, and that is the Precursor period. Now, the Precursors can also be called architects. In summary, they were just a very widely advanced alien race, and they were trying to search for a cure for the Carabacterium that was on the planet 4546b. There are many areas that your character can visit that were created by the architects. That includes the Quarantine Enforcement Platform, which was the turret, the Disease Research Facility, Alien Thermal Plant, and Sanctuary Caches. This is also around the time they began constructing aliens known as Warpers. They were a cyborg of sorts. They were mechanical but also organic. Warpers essentially just have the power to warp themselves and anything else short distances. Well, things smaller than it, of course. The architects later discover that a Sea Emperor Leviathan class species produces enzyme 42. They finally believe that they finally have a cure for it, so they capture the poor thing. And they capture her eggs as well. Now, the Sea Emperor Leviathan is really old. In fact, she's too old to produce a right kind of enzyme 42 to be a cure. This results in them trying to hatch the young, which they believe will give a stronger enzyme 42. After they try to do some experiments and end up botching some of them, they put the remaining amount of 5 eggs in an incubator. Now, the architects did some dumb shit, and they took a Sea Dragon Leviathan egg to a disease research facility, hopefully to find a similarity between the two. But the Sea Dragon parent got really pissed and decided to ram into the facility. Because the facility was destroyed, this is when the Carabacterium was released upon the entire planet. And this is when they activated the Quarantine Enforcement Platform, and they stopped working on Warpers as well. All the Sea Emperor Leviathan food sources are dying due to the bacterium, therefore the Sea Emperor Leviathan class just ceases to exist. Except for the last one in the containment, of course. There are sanctuary caches built by the architects, and they evacuate there. They get rid of their bodies and upload their minds to data hubs. This essentially sums up the Precursor period. Now, let's discuss something a little bit shorter for now. Let's discuss the Mercury 2 crash. This was way before the crash of the Aurora, and this was way before the crash of the Degasi. A vessel named the Mercury 2 was shot down by the Quarantine Enforcement Platform. We're mainly just going to be covering Subnautica 1, but this Mercury 2 crash happens in the Arctic Spires, which is an area in below zero. Now, the second time around of them trying to escape, the Quarantine Enforcement Platform shoots Mercury 2 again. And this is when it is a direct hit, and the entire thing just gets destroyed. It is honestly safe to say that all of the survivors are probably just dead. Now that that's all the pre-Subnautica stuff out of the way for now, let's touch back on the main game currently. After the Aurora crash, you get a rescue call from the Sunbeam, which is another vessel. It comes to try to pick you up on Mountain Island. Unfortunately, however, this is where the Quarantine Enforcement Platform resides. The Sunbeam gets destroyed and you're just kind of stuck again. After a lot of traversing through biomes like the Blood Kelp Forest, Lost River, and even the Lava Zone, you finally find the facility where the Sea Emperor Leviathan mother resides. She's been telepathically communicating with Riley throughout the game, and she explains that the eggs have to be hatched in order to get rid of the coronavirus. In order to hatch the eggs, however, you're going to need to do some fetch quests on some plants and life matter. After successfully creating the substance in order to hatch the baby Leviathans, they spew out the right form of enzyme 42. After Riley interacts with it, he is cured of the virus. Now, the Quarantine Enforcement Platform can be shut off, and you weren't able to do this because you were infected. But now that you're not infected, you can successfully turn off the turret, therefore letting you escape on your own terms safely. But how are you going to do it? Well, throughout the game, you are finding small components to help build an escape rocket. You gain various materials from various biomes throughout the game, and these in turn help you build the right sort of components for the rocket. Things like the cockpit, fuel reserve, that sort of thing. That's when you start going on fetch quests for some materials and you build the rocket and escape. And thus, the game ends. There you go, Subnautica. So now that we covered the survivors, the Degasi story, and whatnot, let's just talk about the universe of Subnautica as a whole, right? This is where some odd little tidbits get thrown into play. Let's touch on some radio messages that I've been putting off. So there were actually a few radio distress signals of sorts that were given from Warpers themselves. There's a small handful of them. One claims that there's 9 new biological subjects designated, and their mode is set to hunting and analyzing. The other claims that subject 11783 is destroyed, and that they're patrolling now. A target unaccounted for is 1. This one person unaccounted for is obviously Riley. Now the only reason the Warpers knew about the other survivors is because their radios output a signal that could be tracked by the Warpers. It wouldn't be crazy to say that some of the survivors may have died at the hands of the Warpers. But in the beginning of your game, your radio gets broken. You can't give out cries for help, you can only receive messages. This means that the Warpers really don't know where the hell you are or where your life pod is. They claim subject 11783 has been taken care of, so to speak, which probably means it was just the latest survivor that got killed by them, which means that you're next. But what did we really do again? Because I said that the architects were creating them, but I didn't really say for what purpose. Well, the architects made warpers to kill people infected with the Kara bacterium. And as we could tell from some of the distress signals, there was at least one person infected with the Kara bacterium. Essentially, as soon as you come out of the life pod, you're pretty much infected. The biome known as the Lost River contains the disease research facility. And like I had said before, that's where the sea dragon attacked and destroyed everything and released the Kara bacterium. You can actually scan one of the corpses of the warpers and it'll be called the Self-Warping Quarantine Enforcer Unit. Now, given by that name, a quarantine enforcer probably means that they're trying to stop the virus any way they can, by enforcing their warping powers or their ability to hurt. What's funny is that there is a certain infection stage that your character goes through. At the start of the game, warpers actually don't attack you or are hostile towards you. But as soon as you start going towards certain spots in the game, your infection stage starts increasing. And then they actually stop trying to attack you or be hostile towards you once you're cured of the Kara virus by touching Enzyme 42. Warpers can warp a majority of things in the game. Most of the stuff is smaller, if not the same size as a warper in this game, besides Leviathans obviously, and maybe reefbacks. And that usually accounts for small biters, bone sharks, stalkers, ampules, you name it. Now if you haven't put 2 and 2 together, they're made to fight the bacterium, but since the Sea Emperor children and Enzyme 42 is helping the planet get rid of this bacterium, what the hell are the warpers gonna do? Well, we honestly don't know yet. They could self-destruct, they could just keep navigating, searching for God knows how long for new victims. What's a cool little feature is that they can do more damage to you depending on how high the infection stage is. They can actually shoot warping projectiles. It teleports you to the warper. You can get teleported out of your Seamoth and Prawn suit too. Now, touching on another kind of funny radio message, this just so happens to be the same people behind the creation of Battlefield Friends, which if you didn't know was a very popular machinima animation series back in the day in like early 2010s maybe. It'd be criminal to say to not give the people their credit. I used to watch this one animator all the time. His name goes by either Johnny Ethko or Apsro. He is one of the voice actors in the radio message. The second voice is also known as a guy named Neebs. He would play a character called Noob in Battlefield Friends. It was a really crazy message because I used to watch their animations all the time. They're part of a larger YouTube channel known as Neebs Gaming now. Skipping all the really funny sandwich talk, they pretty much claim that they're from Alterra HQ, but they're saying that they can't really help you. They said you'll have to meet them halfway, and by doing this they give you a password to the captain's quarters. In the quarters there's a terminal that's still active which has the blueprints to the escape rocket that you'll need to build.
This is Alterra HQ. This may be your only communications window. We can't send a rescue ship all the way out there, so Aurora, you're just gonna have to meet us halfway. We've uploaded blueprints to the ship's computer.
We're doing a sandwich run, you in?
Yeah, give me a second. Black box data shows the high security terminal in the captain's quarters is still functional.
Becky's leaving like in 5 minutes.
All right, tell Becky I'll just take the regular.
The regular.
Yeah, she'll know what I mean. The code should
And
be...
if she doesn't?
Just tell her the regular, dude.
Okay.
The
if I say regular, and she's like, what's the regular? I have to come all the way back up here.
The code should be 2679. The regular's just a ham and cheese.
Okay, would you just say ham and cheese?
Ham and cheese.
Okay.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into Alterra now that I mention it. There's a decent amount of stuff to talk about when it comes to Alterra, the company that your main character Riley Robinson works for. The company, corporation, whatever you want to call it, that owned the Aurora that crashed. The main mission by Alterra was to send the Aurora to help construct a phase gate, which was just going to help you travel between galaxies quicker and more efficiently. What you'll later find out is that Alterra is heavily involved in arms trade, and most of their benefits and profits come from supplying weaponry to a lot of different factions and causing war. You might try to link this to some sort of real-life arms trades of sorts, where corporations or companies make money off of the deaths of war victims. There was a war period known as the Expansion. They threatened to cut off supplies and weapons weapons, and it's said to have been a turning point in conflicts between factions. They're a very strict corporation, as they don't let anybody other than police bear arms. Not only this, but they even tell you in the game that you owe 1 trillion credits to Alterra Corporation. In my playthroughs, this prompt of the PDA usually seems to happen when I pick up a diamond. Or it just happens randomly, I don't know. They expect all of their Aurora Crash necessary equipment to be reimbursed by the workers, which just so happens to be Riley Robinson. Not only reimbursed, but for their full market price as well. There are a lot of motives and just ways that Alterra works by picking up abandoned PDAs in the Aurora Crash. They're responsible for a lot of items such as the Prawn Suit, Cyclops, and just a lot of tools that you can get aided with on your Subnautica journey. Now, although I said I didn't want to touch too much on Subnautica Below Zero lore, this just so happens to explain more in depth about the Alterra. Subnautica Below Zero took place 2 years after the events of Subnautica, therefore 2 years after the events of the Aurora Crash. In some abandoned PDAs in the Subnautica Below Zero world, the Alterra say communications with ships outside of the phase gate network can take weeks or months in ordinary circumstances, and is commonly interrupted. The Aurora was a very expensive ship, and there will be a lot of shareholders that would get pissed if they figured out what happened to it, so they were trying their best to reestablish contact. But if you really read PDAs closely, you'll know that Alterra has a network of directors, and they like to make some sort of publicity stunt, or they like to make scare stories, or they like to assure people. Basically, they like to throw shit out of their ass and lie to the cameras. This PDA is very interesting as it does show the corporate greed and the mindset that Alterra has. I'll be paraphrasing a lot of it. Essentially, there is a spokesperson of sorts, and there are a couple named people within the dialogue. The spokesperson claims that the Aurora had conducted an emergency landing on an uncharted planet. This obviously isn't the case, as we obviously crashed and got shot the fuck down. The spokesperson really has a lot of dodgy answers and is very vague with them. He claims the ship landed due to unexpected damages of sorts. He pretty much goes on to say that usually when a ship of that scale happens, it's not really that big of a deal. He claims they're built to last and that there really shouldn't be anything to worry about. Now, he seems to answer certain stuff pretty confidently and positively until he gets asked, will there be a fall in the Alterra dividend? In which case the PDA ends with him saying thank you, that's all we have time for. Now, this is where the greed really starts pouring in. Alterra seems to give a hell of a fuck about their shareholders and investments. Who knows what they will do in order to keep that profit. Now, when I mentioned the Sunbeam getting shot down, there was apparently a recording that said, hey Alterra, we got one of your birds in the soup over here. It looks like they took static survivors. We're moving in for a closer look. Now, although the Sunbeam is a much smaller ship compared to the Aurora, and it's a trade ship, they're not really fit to get put on rescue missions and evacuate crew members. But according to the PDA that you could find in the Kappa mining site, it was just enough reassurance to the shareholders for Alterra. It even states that Alterra share prices rose to their quarterly high on the news. Wasn't that good for Alterra, huh? The ship, the Aurora, had a command team of 23, an engineering team of 85, support crew of 40, and passengers of 9. What's funny about the Aurora area in the game is that it counts as its own separate biome. It is within a place called the Crash Zone, which is home to many Reaper Leviathans and is a highly dangerous area. Knock on wood, however, in my playthrough, when I go to the Crash Zone, I haven't gotten attacked by them. I quickly just go onto the bridge of the ship and haul ass. There are many different areas within the Aurora ship that you can still explore. I'll list a couple, but they're not limited to just these. There's the Laboratory, Administration's Office, Captain's Quarters, Prawn Bay, Seamoth Bay, that sort of thing. And is a very good place for high tier loot, and a lot of high tier fragments for very high tier items such as propulsion cannon or even the prawn suit. What's kind of funny is that there was actually a 2D image of the Aurora in the prototype of Subnautica out in the distance instead of a 3D model that you can walk into. This is also what appears when you were in the intro in the prototype and you would look up and see it explode. It was actually 2D. Speaking of biomes, let's touch on areas of the game, shall we? This might be a pretty lengthy part of the video as I intend to go into every mini biome and larger biome and talk about what they contain and what to look out for. We'll start off with the starting point of where your life pod lands, the safe shallows. Like the name suggests, this is a pretty safe area and you got lucky to have landed in it. It has some small cave systems in there with some crash fish, which are kind of creepy and they do chase you and explode, but usually they don't really cause too much of a ruckus. What may make this biome a little bit dangerous is that some of the enemies from different biomes adjacent to it might pour in. This may include something like stalkers from the kelp forest or sand sharks from the red grass biomes. It is obviously a great place for newcomers to feel safe within for the most part, and it is a place that I loved going to on my first playthrough because I was a scared little pussy. Although the resources may be deemed tier 1 or low tier in comparison to the higher end stuff you may acquire later in the game, this game does a pretty good job of making all the materials come full circle. Although you may just need a few titanium to build your first standard O2 tank, titanium is a very massive ingredient in late game builds too. Just because you progress deeper into different biomes and more dangerous territory does not mean that the stuff in the starting area is going to be completely useless. In fact, quite the opposite. Our next biome is the kelp forest. This is home to a little bit higher tier loot in terms of what you can find in the chunks. You can find gold, lead, and even silver ore. You can find a lot of metal salvage here as well because the stalkers love gathering and picking up random small items. A little note that I figured out on my second playthrough is that they can actually take cameras from your scanner rooms and bring them and gather them into the kelp forest. So they pretty much try to carry whatever they can back to their home. There's a handful of kelp forests throughout the map, and they all contain something different, whether it being a destroyed life pod, some wrecks, or even just the basic materials that they always carry. The fragments that you can collect from these places are mobile vehicle bay fragments and sea glide fragments. But if you're lucky enough to find one of the wrecks in the kelp forests, then you can get even better loot. These fragments can range from beacons to stasis rifles, grav traps, and bioreactors. Very easy way to get some mid to late game stuff if you have a laser cutter on you. Now the next biome is the Blood Kelp Zone Trench. There are two different blood kelp zones to watch out for, but the blood kelp trench is located southwest from Life Pod 5. Me personally, I love diving into the blood kelp zone trench instead of the other one. This is because I can fit my Cyclops through it and I may bump on some stuff. But the worst stuff to look out for is probably ampules, warpers, and blighters. Although it is a very tight squeeze, you can easily do this and get into the back end of the Lost River. What I personally do is I navigate my Cyclops downwards, I move forward a little bit and make a right, and then I keep going down until I see the entrance to one of the Lost River places. But instead of trying to make a 180 and turn back around to where I'm front facing, I simply back up. If any of you know what I'm talking about and you understand what that means, then great. This place is also home to gel sacks, which is a very annoying item to try to find. I've had really the worst luck in trying to find gel sacks in my playthrough, so whenever I find one, I'm incredibly happy. The fragments you can get are actually pretty high end. They consist of Moonpool, Nuclear Reactor, and the Prawn Suit arms. This is one of the later game areas, so there will be larger deposits which you'll need the Prawn Suit drilling arm in order to mine. What's neat about this trench is that it's also home to a lot of urine. Sorry, I choked on my coffee, but what you do need to know is that it's also home to a lot of rubies and quartz, as well as lithium, of course, can't go wrong with that. What's neat about having gel sacks and rubies in the same biome is that you could just make aerogel with them. There's also stuff like deep shrooms that you can find, and that helps you in creating hydrochloric acid for later crafting recipes. But the data boxes are actually pretty good. You get a Cyclops fire suppression system and a Cyclops sonar upgrade. The suppression system, I think, takes away something like 200 energy from your Cyclops' power cells immediately in order to shut off everything and turn off the fire that's in your building. That is to say, if you really don't have the fire extinguishers and you forgot to craft them, this is a good emergency button. I really needed this on my first playthrough because I got screwed over heavily by a Ghost Leviathan pushing me. Next biome is going to be the Bulb Zone. The depth is about 140 to 480 meters. There's a lot of goodies in this zone, but it can be quite dangerous if you come unprepared. It is filled to the brim with bone sharks and ampules. Plus, since it's pretty close to the Aurora, the radiation might touch you a little bit, so a radiation suit might be needed if you want to explore really deep into it. The data boxes are pretty good. Now, you can get a Cyclops sonar upgrade in this area, but what you'll soon find out is that there are different areas that they can spawn in each time you start up a new world. So an area that might be in a wreck somewhere, I don't know, let's say in the red grass biome, might be somewhere different in the blood kelp zone. So it's up to you to find them and snuff them out. You can get blueprints from alien containment, lightweight high capacity tank, a reinforced dive suit which is very good for exploring the lava zone and not getting burned too hard, a repulsion cannon which is the direct opposite from a propulsion cannon, and a water filtration suit. Although I don't really acquire the water filtration suit, it can be quite beneficial to those who forget to bring a bottle or two. You'll find early on that mass making bladderfish into water bottles is kind of a tedious activity for only 20 H2O. This kind of helps you gain more H2O, it caps at 2 bottles per day, and although this does give you the same amount as filtered water, which is 20 H2O, and minuses 3 food when drinking it, simply wearing this can give you up to 40 H2O total in one single in-game day. This is also home to something called the Sea Crown. This is a highly rare form of flora. So rare, in fact, that really the only big pocket of them is in the small cave systems underneath where the Sea Emperor Leviathan resides in the containment. The Sea Crown is also used to help craft the hatching enzyme for the kids. Next we have the Crag Fields. There's actually a decently safe biome. There's maybe groups of bone sharks here and there. You might get some tiger weeds trying to spit stuff at you, but as long as you're moving a centimeter an hour, you will be fine. The fragments here are actually pretty good. You get fragments for a Cyclops engine, hulls, modification stations, and scanner rooms. Honestly, some very great fragments for little to no risk at all. The modification station has always been a bitch personally for me to find, and is simply just very useful in upgrading your vehicles, as well as turning some of your tools into something a little bit cooler. And then we have the Crash Zone. I say it like that because it is home to the Reaper Leviathans. It is stated here it is home to actually 10 Reaper Leviathans. What's neat about this place is that there is a Crash life pod somewhere close, and you can get a creature decoy, which is actually very useful for your Cyclops for distracting Ghost Leviathans. The fauna in this part is actually pretty plentiful. You can get a lot of dangerous fish, and a lot of passive fish, and a lot of fish that you could just grab and eat. The most notable fragments are the power transmitter and the propulsion cannon here. But, however, there are actually 4 different areas to the Crash Zone, and we'll touch on them. The main Crash Zone is located on the easternmost part of the map, so it's surrounded by a couple other biomes like kelp forest, safe shallows, that sort of thing. There is a Crash Zone Trench. This is the area behind the Aurora, a very fun place to base. It's a very good spot to look for Cyclops bridge and engine fragments, but I look anywhere else but this place. Then we have the Crash Zone Mesas. It is in the southern portion of the Crash Zone. Be careful though, because although there are a small handful of mesas here, and the flowers do look kind of pretty, there is a Reaper Leviathan lurking about here. And then we have the Crash Zone Spit. It is a pretty small area, which is just pretty much the plot of land on the side of the ship. You can get propulsion cannon fragments from here, which is decent. And then we have the Crater's Edge. So this is pretty much just the dead zone and the kind of game boundary that the developers put in. You're not really supposed to live here because it gives no resources and it's highly dangerous. It is home to many adult Ghost Leviathans, which are just bigger and badder. Honestly, not too much to say about this, except that it is believed that this was the old home of a gargantuan Leviathan, which, if you look that up, there are plenty of mods trying to recreate the size of it and the sheer danger it creates. What is really funny about this place, however, is that if you manage to get 8,192 meters in any direction, the player reaches the farthest reachable point of the crater edge. If you manage to pull this off, whatever you're piloting, or if you're doing it solo like a mad lad, you'll be teleported 10 meters above sea level and up to 250 meters away from the center of the map. Now, I did mention adult Ghost Leviathans lurking around, but once you reach 4,000 meters in this crater's edge, they actually stop spawning. It's just how the biome mechanic works for them. I guess the crater's edge biome just stops once you reach that level, and therefore the enemies that are supposed to spawn into that biome stop too. And now we have the dunes.
Detecting multiple Leviathan class life forms in the region. Are you certain whatever you're doing is worth it?
It is not worth it. It is so not worth it. I'm leaving. What I've noticed about why I find this game freaky sometimes is that it's normally because I'm looking at very big bodies of water. If I'm in a place such as the Lost River or something where I could see sides of a wall, I'd feel a little bit better because at least not a lot of things are left up to the imagination at that point. If I'm smack dab in the middle of the dunes biome and I see no seafloor and I see no surface water, I'm gonna freak the fuck out. And this is kind of what the dunes is. What's very funny about this area, however, is that it yields a lot of good loot. But to counteract this, they just spam fuck you with a bunch of Reaper Leviathans lurking about. These data boxes yield blueprints such as the Cyclops Depth Module Mark 1, the Cyclops Shield Generator, a reinforced dive suit, water filtration suit, ultra high capacity tank, and a vehicle upgrade console. These are very useful for late game exploration. What you'll begin to notice about the fragments you can find in the biomes is that many different biomes yield the same kinds of fragments. So for the dunes, you may get moonpool fragments, nuclear reactor fragments, power cell charger fragments, prawn suit drill arm, grappling arm fragments, and thermal plant fragments. They don't just cut off one biome to only giving a certain type of fragment, because like I stated before in the Blood Kelp Zone Trench, you can find prawn suit drill arm and grappling arms and even torpedo arm fragments there as well. So they kind of give you a little bit of options on where to go and where to find them. The Grand Reef I hardly go to, but this is a decent biome. They're home to sea treader Leviathans, which kind of just exist and they walk. But this place is also home to 2 big Ghost Leviathans. You can get a lot of pretty good blueprints from this place as well. Cyclops Decoy Tube upgrades, Depth Module Mark 1 for the Cyclops, Docking Bay Repair Modules for the Cyclops, Cyclops Sonar upgrade, Cyclops Thermal Reactor Module, and a Repulsion Cannon. You can get a lot of pretty decent loot here, including gel sacks, rubies, lithium, titanium, uraninite. The fragments are pretty scarce compared to the others like moonpool fragments and thermal plant fragments. But if you just so happen to find the wrecks in here, you can get a lot more options. Next, we have the grassy plateaus. I call it the red grass biome just because it's red grass. But this is pretty much like the third biome you're probably going to run into first. Normally what I do is I make a beeline through the kelp forest and then I just end up in a red grass biome, so. But you can find some pretty decent stuff here through data boxes and wrecks and destroyed life pods. You can find some ultra glide fins and a lightweight high capacity tank as well as a vehicle upgrade console. You can also find sea moth fragments here, which is a very good early, mid, and even late game vehicle. If you just so happen to find the wrecks in these grassy plateau areas, you're going to get a plethora of different options for fragments. I'm going to try to list them all. These include, let me take a deep breath. Battery charger, bioreactor, laser cutter, light stick, mobile vehicle bay, modification station, prawn suit, claw arm, propulsion cannon, scanner room, and sea moth fragments. Obviously, when you go into these wrecks as well, you can also find scannables with your scanner. I mean, you're never going to stop scanning different types of things in these wrecks. I just didn't decide to list these off because, I mean, they're decorative, they're miscellaneous, so. But most of the wrecks, if not all of them, will contain some sort of decorative furniture, like a chair or a bench. Next, we have the mountains. This is a biome you go to actually to find the mountain island where the quarantine enforcement platform is. Not my favorite place to go because if you're trying to search for like the little alien containment areas below the turret, you can still hear Reaper Leviathan roars from far away, but still it's not very fun. On the seabed and on the wrecks, you can get a lot of fragments, so I'm going to try to take a deep breath again for this. But you can get Cyclops engine, light stick, modification station, moonpool nuclear reactor, prawn suit claw arm fragments, prawn suit grappling arm, prawn suit propulsion cannon fragments, and prawn suit torpedo arm fragments. Very good if you want to deck out your prawn suit, come here, but also be aware it's home to about 7 or so Reaper Leviathans. The mushroom forest, honestly, pretty vibey. Not too dangerous, but if you tread too far, you might run into one of the Reaper Leviathans. There are actually 2 different mushroom forests, one northeast, one northwest. The northeastern one is pretty small in comparison to the northwestern one. It's home to a lot of pretty good stuff. It's home to gold, diamond, lithium, salt deposits, silver ore, what's not to like. You can get some Cyclops fragments here, as well as some modification station, power transmitters, and moonpool fragments. There's also a large tree mushroom in the northeastern mushroom forest if you can find it, and there's also a small cave system of sorts underneath it too. The northwestern one also has some giant mushroom trees, and you can get pretty much the same kinds of fragments from here and from different wrecks. There are also data boxes here with some blueprints on some really good useful tools if you haven't gotten them yet, so I would highly recommend trying to search for those as well. And then we have the Sea Treaders Pass. It just exists. You can get some good Cyclops data box blueprints, and a lot of Cyclops fragment pieces as well. Now, as far as I know, Sea Treaders pretty much are passive. They were just walking when I was super up close to one, and they just tend to migrate in packs, but I saw one alone. They're big, but don't let their size scare you. There's also home to some pretty decent loot for what it's worth, so don't let the depth and the darkness and these 3-legged creatures scare you. Now we have the Sparse Reef. Located southwest of Life Pod 5, you can find a lot of pretty decent loot that you can find in pretty much every biome we've already talked about. You can get some pretty good fragments, including power cell chargers, which I'm in desperate need of always. And home to pretty much no danger at all for what it's worth. The fauna includes peepers, reefbacks, Reginald, shoal of fishes, shuttlebugs, and spadefish. This pretty much means that there's really nothing dangerous that could hurt you here. So honestly, I highly recommend going here. It does look a little creepy at first because it is a very big open area of water, but if you don't stray too far from the sparse reef, and you'll know if you strayed too far because the screen kind of tints green a little bit when you get into the sparse reef. And now we have underwater islands. It has a lot of rock formations suspended above the ocean floor. There's a lot of bone sharks here, like a lot. Not much to say about this one. You can get some propulsion cannon fragments and some Cyclops stuff. The ores are pretty much the same for these mid-tier biomes. That includes silver, gold, lithium, you name it. We'll speedrun the rest of these because these are pretty much just cave versions of the other ones we mentioned. We have the Blood Kelp Caves, which is home to things like crab squids. We have Bonefield Caves. We have Bulb Zone Caves, which you could put 2 and 2 together, are the caves of the Bulb Zones. We have the Deep Grand Reef, which is just a deeper Grand Reef. We have a Deep Sparse Reef, which is just the Sparse Reef, but deeper. We have the Dunes Cave, which is caves in the dunes. We have Grand Reef Caves, which is caves in the Grand Reef. We have Grassy Plateau Caves, which is caves in the grassy plateaus. We have the Kelp Forest Caves. We have the Mountains Caves, Mushroom Forest Caves, Safe Shallows Caves, Sea Treaders Tunnel Caves, and Underwater Islands Caves. All of them pretty much have the same kind of resources as pretty much any other cave: sandstone, shale, limestone deposits maybe. Not all cave systems contain all different sort of chunks though, so be aware of that. We have the Lava Lakes, which is home to a very late game item known as kyanite. There's also kyanite deposits, crystal, and sulfur. And then we have the Lost River, which is a very vibey area, honestly. The Ghost Leviathans really don't scare me in this game as much as Reapers do. It's kind of a twisty area, so it's kind of easy to get lost. So I highly recommend bringing at least like 2 or 3 beacons. Maybe 1 might suffice if you're good at mapping out stuff in your head. And there's also some mini-ish biomes, which consist of the lava castle all the way at the bottom of the map. And there's also a corridor in the inactive lava zone. and maybe just a lava geyser too. But those really aren't major things. One thing to note, however, is that there are also Reaper Leviathan skeletons on the floor of the lava zones. This was because the sea dragons that reside in here that shoot fireballs and are mean and can actually one-shot the player had to bring down some Reaper Leviathans for lunch. This was because of the sea dragons' food sources were all getting shit on by the Carabacterium. The lava castle has something nice inside. It has some free kyanite for you to grab as well as the alien thermal plant. There's a very limited amount of species of dangerous animals in the lava zone, obviously besides the sea dragons. But look out for the leeches that drain power from your Cyclops. They stick to it until you pretty much fight them off. Even if you're parked with the engine off and you have nothing drawing power, they still siphon percentage of power from you over time. The icons for these little leeches also show up on the hologram of the Cyclops, the same hologram where it shows you where a fire started in the Cyclops or the external damage locations. Let's talk about a couple of the big baddies in the game now. Let's start with the Reaper Leviathan. You'll possibly know when you run near a Reaper Leviathan because you'll hear loud echoing roars. Now, although I've seen footage of people getting caught and jump scared, that usually never happens to me. I hear the echoes of the roars from many meters away when I'm near one. They're almost as big as a Cyclops submarine. There are 25 Reaper Leviathans total in Subnautica. That would be 7 in the mountains, 8 in the dunes, and 10 in the crash zone. Now, although it says that their roars are a form of echolocation, which basically means that if you can hear their roars and they can see you, it doesn't work that way in the game. It's pretty much if you get close enough to it and get noticed. But I think some people genuinely believe this is how it works in the game, but it's really not. They can grab your prawn suit and your sea moth and do considerable amounts of damage to it. It is seen as an excessive threat and to avoid at all costs. There is a special feature that the Reaper Leviathan can perform. You see, it does 80 damage to you. Now, if you're below 80 damage, you might think that it'll just bite you and you'll instantly die, but no. The developers made a funny little animation to where it'll use its mandibles to grab you and then perform an animation of it kind of just killing you and eating you. A bit of a Mortal Kombat finisher move. Now, there used to be a lot of things going on with Reaper Leviathans back then. You see, before all these updates fixed a lot of things, Reaper Leviathans used to be able to free roam more and jump out of the water way more excessively than they do now. You would find them in places like the safe shallows. No place would be safe from these guys. And also they do have hit points of about 5,000, so they're not exactly easy to take care of. Now, I've seen a lot of videos of people just murdering these things, and you can do that. It just takes a fucking while. More often than not, you just shoot it with a stasis rifle to slow it the hell down, and then you just knife it a bunch, and then you repeat the process for maybe a few minutes. I previously mentioned that they used to be able to jump out of the water. Well, they also used to just be able to fly in the air due to a glitch. Now, some small trivia about the Reaper Leviathan is actually quite interesting. It used to emit bright green bioluminescence from its eyes, but that was scrapped in a later update. Now, the Reaper Leviathan that was lurking around the mushroom forest on the outskirts of it, there actually used to be one that used to spawn inside the mushroom forest near the Aurora, but it was removed before full release. When people think of Subnautica, they usually think of the Reaper Leviathan first, and it's no surprise they usually put it on some cover art for the games, or they just make it a well-known monster in some of the art style altogether. It used to actually be about the same size as a bone shark or a stalker, and it used to be a much smaller size than what it is now. Corey Strader, the art director of Unknown Worlds Entertainment, you know, the people who made Subnautica, had said in a Discord message that the model was actually created to be a small size, but the potential it had to be very large and dangerous seemed kind of a cool idea. And I bet they didn't really have many apex predators in thought at the time, so why not do this one? Let's switch over to the Ghost Leviathan. Now, there is something called a giant cove tree within the Lost River. As far as we know, this is the only place we can find this tree. But it is pretty much the nesting area to the Ghost Leviathans. You can see the eggs upon and around the tree, and they look fairly blue and clear, kind of like the Ghost Leviathan's appearance. Now, although it is deemed the second largest creature in Subnautica, right behind the Sea Dragon Leviathan, the juvenile version of this adult Ghost Leviathan is actually deemed the third largest. Just because it's really big, however, doesn't mean that it insta-kills you. Like I said before, the Sea Dragon Leviathan is the only thing that can one-shot the player. But without your reinforced dive suit, the Ghost Leviathan can get you pretty close to death's door. An infinite number of Ghost Leviathans spawn in the crater's edge, but this is based on time. The longer the player stays within the crater's edge, the more Ghost Leviathans will spawn. And when I say infinite, I don't mean that an infinite amount will spawn at the same time. I simply mean that if you decide that you want to kill one of the adult Ghost Leviathans in the crater's edge, they'll just keep spawning back, but there is a cap to it. There are horns on the outside of its head and long protrusions sticking out, which kind of resemble that of a hammerhead shark. The Ghost Leviathan will use these features on its head to ram into stuff. I had accidentally lured a Ghost Leviathan one time too close to the entrance of a lost river, in which case my Cyclops was trying to get through and he was ramming and pushing it into the walls. This ultimately caused my downfall as it kept creating fires. I highly recommend bringing creature decoys for the Ghost Leviathan as it will corner you and ram into you until there's nothing left of your ship. Something seems to be drawing them towards the void. We don't know exactly why, but that seems to be the lore, according to one of the people at Unknown Worlds Entertainment. The Ghost Leviathans within the Lost River are considered juveniles as they are considerably smaller. There are adult Ghost Leviathans that lurk within the game. There are 2 in the Grand Reef and 1 in the Northern Blood Kelp Zone. This obviously is not counting the infinite number that can spawn in the void, but what's neat about the size of these Ghost Leviathans is that the adult Ghost Leviathans in the void are 1.15 times larger than the adult Ghost Leviathans you could find anywhere else in the map. It is close to double the size of a Reaper Leviathan in length. There is even commentary on the growth style of the Ghost Leviathan juvenile stating that they show no signs of stopping, which may allude to some theory that the species grows continuously and never entirely stops. Now let's touch on the Sea Dragon Leviathan. This Leviathan is deemed the largest, and there are 2 in the inactive lava zone and 1 in the lava lakes. Although it is slightly larger than the Ghost Leviathan, it has the same health pool as a Reaper Leviathan, only at 5,000 health points. The Ghost Leviathan has 8,000. I've mentioned it a couple times already, but its bite can insta-kill the player no matter what. It does have other attacks, however, but they don't insta-kill the player. This ranges from the sea dragon swatting you with their hands to shooting fireballs from its mouth. Now, I mentioned way back in the video, but there was a sea dragon that had rammed into the Precursor disease research facility. So which one of these sea dragons did it? Which one of them was guilty? Well, actually none of the 3 that you can find in the game. At least, not alive. If you go to the place where the disease research facility is, there's a skeleton remain of the sea dragon Leviathan that had attacked the place. This is due to the fact that the sea dragon suffered major head trauma, as the structures and building materials that the Precursors had access to were very high in density. What's also funny is that the sea dragon used to be much larger. The developers just didn't even remember what scale it was originally supposed to be, so they said c'est la vie and left it to be extremely large. They had quickly downsized it, however, just because it had difficulty navigating the terrain. Now, the size of this creature could also just line up with the idea of deep sea or abyssal gigantism. Have you ever watched deep sea creature spotted videos that we've never seen before and they're just huge as hell? Well, this is where this sort of theory refers to. The idea is because since there's probably less food and it's a lot colder, if you want to get scientific, there's increased dissolved oxygen, which basically just means that it's higher and it plays a role in deep sea gigantism. There was a study in real life claiming that there were amphipod crustaceans that just so happened to seem to correlate in size with the dissolved oxygen levels of deeper waters. It's no news and no shocker that the deeper water goes, the higher the pressure is. Therefore, these creatures try to gain size, muscle mass, what have you, in order to combat asphyxiation. Now let's touch on the Sea Emperor Leviathan. Being an old as hell Leviathan at 2,600 years, it is technically the largest living thing in the game, but that doesn't really count because we're going to be talking about hostile Leviathans really, and this one is passive. There's definitely a decent amount to talk about the Sea Emperor Leviathan, but basically she's the last of her kind. And this is pretty much where I re-explain the story plot. She needs you to hatch her young in order to create a potent enough enzyme 42 to cure the Carabacterium on the planet. She is telepathic and she can talk to you through your brain sometimes. What unfortunately is a sad fact of the matter is that things die with age. And although you hatched her young and she's very grateful and she lets them go through the teleporter and just spread the enzyme 42, she inevitably is just going to die in that containment. In fact, you can see her slowly dying on the sea floor if you stay. The Sea Emperor Leviathan had stated that the Precursors weren't able to hear the telepathy. This means the Precursors probably just couldn't receive telepathy signals somehow, and therefore couldn't hear her say to let the young go and be free. I pretty much explained a decent chunk of the major information on her, just simply giving a brief synopsis of the story's plot and what you do. So we won't be touching too much on her. Now, I could be talking about the Sea Treader Leviathans because, yeah, they are technically Leviathan class. But, like I said, there's not really much to say about them. They're the smallest Leviathan. But, like I had said, they just have a path to migrate called Sea Treader's Path in the game. I guess a neat little tidbit is that it's immune to the stasis rifle. Now, although I mentioned that I presume that they were harmless, they can actually do damage through kicks and stomps. But they're practically passive because you have to get right in front of them to where their leg is for them to get pissed at you. As long as you're kind of around them and you're not right in front of them by their leg, you're fine. They're more of a defensive Leviathan than anything. They have quite a few Easter eggs as well, let's touch on those. They have a reference to Natural Selection 2 via a poster within Cabin 6 of the Aurora. Natural Selection 2 is one of Unknown World Entertainment's previous games. There is also an arcade gorge toy that you can find on the Aurora, which resembles the creature the gorge from Natural Selection 2 as well. After activating the data terminal in the quarantine enforcement platform, it says resistance is fertile, which is just a joke on Star Trek's Borg's line, resistance is futile. When you fabricate the survival knife for the first time, there is a dialogue mentioning the planet Obraxis Prime, but this is just a reference reference to one of the animators on Subnautica who goes by the username Obraxis. His real name is Scott McDonald. Then there is talk about something called Strader 6. If you're noticing back in the screenshots I was mentioning as well as some of the commentary, you'll know that Strader is referring to Corey Strader, who is a Subnautica developer. There's a lot to read on the PDA when you find it though, and I won't be talking about it here. In the soundtrack in the Sparse Reef, there's an audio clip featured Donald Trump saying China. Now there's something called a star wall. Well, what the hell is a star wall? There's a PDA dialogue for the stasis rifle and something in Paul Torgal's journal entries. He mentioned something known as a star wall. This is probably just a cutesy little Easter egg towards a game called Star Wall, where you're pretty much narwhals in space trying to hit each other with your horns. Now there is somebody called Sherman Helensky. So when you build your first grow bed, the name will probably say Craig McGill, but there is a rare chance that the name will swap to Sherman Helensky. Me personally, I was looking this up because it states on the Wikipedia page that the reason for this Easter egg is just unknown, and I couldn't even find anything on Google Images, nothing. But after I looked up Sherman Helensky, I know there was an old sound director that had got fired named Simon Chilinsky. It might be a play on words with that guy, but take it with a grain of salt from me. When you aboard the Cyclops, there's probably a certain type of dialogue you may miss or may not miss. It's pretty rare, but I feel like this is one of the more well-known Easter eggs. So usually when you're piloting your vehicles or whatever, you get greeted with something like "Welcome aboard, Captain." Now the Cyclops AI voice has a chance to say "You're the best captain on the planet, I'm not even squidding." Obviously this is a play on words to "I'm not even kidding." Very silly and very strange. I'm not sure if this is really an Easter egg of sorts or they just felt like reusing assets, but there's a game that Unknown Worlds Entertainment had made called Future Perfect. Now I know you probably went to the Quarantine Enforcement platform and you were scanning those weird weapons that the aliens had. Those are just reused assets from that game Future Perfect. Those include the alien relics, alien rifle, doomsday device, and so on. Going to sort of a bittersweet Easter egg now, there is something called CHBC Live. There is a translation device of sorts that can be found in the primary containment facility. There is a term CHBC Live that appears a lot in the data. So what the hell is a CHBC Live? Well, there was a Chinese fan of Subnautica who went by that name, CHBC Live. He made tutorials for the game and the Chinese audience of Subnautica since the farming update. The reason this is a tribute, however, is because he had later died after a long battle with gastric cancer. Godspeed, CHBC Live. Now, I previously mentioned it in the Alterra HQ logs, but yes, there were some voice actors from Neebs Gaming, creator of Battlefield Friends, and many other beautiful, funny animations on YouTube. If you need a refresher on it, I highly recommend going back to the point in time where the recording started. And then we have an unusual doll, which you can find in LifePod 7. Now, you can scan this doll and unlock it as a buildable item, and you can place it inside your habitats and whatnot. Now, judging simply by the appearance, I don't even have to say who it is, but for the sake of those out there, it is clearly PewDiePie. Well, I think I'm going to cut it here. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something new, even for the veterans out there. And if you didn't learn anything new, I hope it was entertaining in any form. If you've watched this far to the outro, it probably was entertaining in some way to you. This game terrified the hell out of me, but I eventually got desensitized to it. Watch my other video on me conquering my fear and beating it. There's definitely a lot more that I didn't exactly dive into, but I feel as if I covered the major topics and even the slightly lesser known topics for the sake of interest. Bless your face. If you sneeze during this video, bless you. Alright, bye guys.